Hi everyone. I'm going to show you how to make a sewing machine cover. Now, there are lots of YouTube videos on how to make a machine cover, but from the ones I've seen, a lot of them are based on the newer modern plastic models, which are more box shape. They have just a much simpler design. Your vintage machines, on the other hand, they've got large pieces at the end, like the balance wheel end. They'll, depending on what model you've got, they kind of curve narrower towards the front. If you have a motor, mine doesn't have a motor, but you've got the motor which is going to stick out. So your vintage machine has got a prettier shape compared to plastic machines. Now, the easiest way to do a sewing machine cover, or the most obvious, is to measure the length of the machine, measure the width of the machine, and then measure the height. You've also got to try and factor in your spool pin as well. You've also got to think about, and you wouldn't need to worry about this so much on a plastic machine, is if your machine has a hand crank. Now, my machine sits in a table, and although I could measure the length of the base, I've got to also factor in the hand crank. With most measuring guides, you've got to work out whether your machine's going to have a flat top, and you've got to try and work out the length of the material as well. Plus, it uses maths. I don't like using maths. So I'm going to show you a way that you can measure your machine in a much easier way without using maths, and you can make a cover for any type of machine. So this is a 201. This is in a cabinet and it has a hand crank. But you might have a machine that already has a case. That's easy because it's a nice uniform shape all the way along. It'd be very easy to measure up to the top, all the way across and then down. But you might not have a case for your machine. You might have just the machine and just a base. You might not want to have the cover going all the way down to the base of the machine. You might want to have the cover just going to the top, so it's just covering the machine itself so that you can see the base. You've also got to factor in, if I give this a turn, that your machine may not be a hand crank. Your machine may have a motor coming out here, which is going to, alter the shape of your cover, unless you follow the dome type cover. Or you might want to make a cover for a featherweight. Now you've got to think about, obviously, the length. Are you going to factor in the edge, or are you going to have that up, in which case your cover is going to fit on the top? Naturally, a cover for this machine is going to be way too big and baggy for this machine. Now, if you're doing it for a featherweight, it's heavier than it looks. Again, you may have a motor on the back. Mine doesn't have a motor. Mine has a hand crank. Again, this is going to bring your cover out to this point. So one size doesn't fit all if you've got different machines, different varieties, ones with cases, ones in cabinets, ones in treadles. What I'm going to show you, you'll be able to replicate across any machine that you've got, and it's really easy to make multiple covers for your machine. One of the things to think about, though, just going to move this around, is not just about the material, the fabric that you use, because obviously you can pick any fabric, but a cover that goes over a wooden case, the cover will just rest on the case. If you make a fabric cover for your machine that doesn't have a case, the cover will naturally sink along and it will buckle. So if you want to protect your machine but also stop the cover from sinking onto the machine, then a fusible foam or a scrim is going to be a lot better because it covers the machine without affecting the machine. Now my 201 has got an oil wick at the top here. The 128 doesn't, but the 15K and the 201K both have an oil wick at the top. If you have a fabric cover, that's just going to rest on the top here, and all it's going to do is suck the oil out of the wick, and then you're going to have a dry wick and you're going to have a soggy cover. So the one I'm going to show you how to make, I'm going to have foam interfacing built in so that it stands freely. But if you're making a cover that's going to cover a wooden base, then it can just be just a fabric cover without any interfacing, because it's just going to rest on top of this wood anyway. But what you're going to need is some cardboard, and I'm going to show you how to do it on a 128, which is a 3/4 base, but the same thing will work on any other machine. So let me get that ready for you. Now, the first thing you need is a piece of cardboard. Now, this cardboard should be taller than your machine, and it should also be wider than your machine. I am just using a piece of packaging. You will also need another piece of cardboard. Doesn't matter if it's not the length of your machine, but it just needs to be stiff. I've just torn this off the same box. But if you have a stiff ruler, I've got my fabric ruler, that will work just as well. So you just want something that is solid and stiff. I'm using my kitchen worktop, as you can probably tell. So the first thing I'm going to do is just put the cardboard, and I'm going to push the machine. Let me move it down a bit. Just going to push it so that it's pinching the cardboard against a solid wall. You can do this on the floor. You can do this anywhere, as long as you can put your machine on a wall. If you're going to measure one that's in a cabinet, obviously you can't, it's going to be more difficult. You just need to be able to hold that piece of cardboard, and when you see what I'm about to do, you'll be able to work that out for a machine in a treadle or in a cabinet. For the purpose of this video, I'm just going to show you with a hand crank. The first thing we want to do, get a marker pen, and with your piece of cardboard or with a ruler, you're just going to work out the height. Now, when I put that piece of cardboard on the top here, it's catching on the presser bar, the spool pin, and the wheel. Mainly, I think the highest part on that is actually the spool pin. But I just want to make a rough guess. I'm just going to make a mark just at the top. That tells me the height of the machine. Next, I'm going to slide that cardboard down the side. Actually, this measure is actually straighter than my wobbly bit of cardboard. I'm going to slide that up, and then I'm going to make another mark. And I'm going to do the same on the other side. So I'm making sure that that is as close to the base as possible. So I've made 2 marks now. I've made my width marks and I've made my height mark. What you can then do, and as I say, a stiff ruler will work really well, is you can then turn it at an angle. So now I know that it's pressing on my wheel, and I'm just going to make just some marks, just holding it round against the widest bit. Now your wheel is the widest part of your machine, although I'll show you the featherweight is actually slightly different. And I'm going to just do the same on the other side. So I'm just holding my ruler in place. Now I can make a mark there. Now if you had a motor, then obviously that's going to stick out a bit more. You may also only want to mark down to your base. You might want a cover that doesn't include the base, in which case, if you have it in a base, you can just make a mark on your cardboard where your base is. This pattern that you're making, this mark making, is going to be the same on this side, the front side of your machine as well, because this is the widest bit. So if your pattern matches this, then it's going to match the other end. You may also want to consider, I'm going to hold that like that, do you want a rounded top or do you want a flat top? If you wanted a flat top, you can just make just a straight line across the top, and then you're going to start following the curves round. If I take this now, and let's just move this out of the way so that you can see the mark making that I've made. Let's hold that up. So now you can see I've made mark. Now that's gonna match your machine. So what I'm gonna do now, let's just tilt the camera so that you can see what I'm gonna do. So I've made marker points. So I'm just gonna roughly start to join that up. Doesn't have to be completely accurate. Now I made a mark there for my base, and on that side now the cover that, you know, I would want to cover my base, but if you don't want to, then you would just draw a line across, and you know that your cover's only going to get to that point. I made a mark for the edge, so I'm just going to carry on going around like that. That's now the side piece of my back, of my machine cover. The next thing that you want to do is add a seam allowance. A good seam allowance to have on a cover, because obviously you don't want the cover to be so tight around your machine, and if you're going to be using foam, then the foam is going to make it even tighter. So you want to mark an inch either side, and that's your seam allowance. I'm probably using the longest ruler, which was fine, but now it's a bit annoying, so I'm just going to roughly guess, but you should just measure an inch seam allowance all the way around. Am I getting that quite right? Yeah. So I'm just rough guessing this, but if you've got a smaller ruler and a bigger workspace, you'll be able to do this a bit better than I am for the purpose of the video. So I just made some dotted lines all the way around, and then simply just match up the dots. So now we have one side of our fabric. Next we want to measure the width, the length of the machine. So let's just put that there. Now the width of a machine, I just push that back. If you have a long ruler, that's great. You want to factor in your hand crank. Oops, let me move that down a bit. So now you can see the hand crank. If you're measuring a cover that's going to go either side of your base, then literally just measure the base. So my base for this 128K is coming up at about 17 and 2/8 of an inch. If you were measuring a cover that would be going from the base of your machine at the presser foot end, and you want to incorporate a crank or your wheel, literally you are just roughly as close as you can measuring. So for a 128K, from one end of the machine incorporating the hand crank, that's coming up at 15 inches. So you want to make a note of the width of the cover that you want it, but you want it as close to the machine as possible, because we're going to add a 1-inch seam allowance either end anyway. So for this particular model, I know that it's going to be 15 inches if I wasn't including the base. If I was going to include the base, then it would be 17 inches, 17 and 2/8 of an inch. Now my machine is old, so this bracket sticks out just a little bit. Make a note on here of your machine size. Next, I want to show you, I'm going to move this out of the way, because even though a 128 is quite a small machine, the featherweight is easier. But the featherweight is also an unusual shape compared to the other machines. Oop, just smacked it then. So I'm gonna, even though that's got drawings on it now, the Amazon package, you would do the same thing with a featherweight. Actually, I could probably, yeah, my piece of cardboard is still wider and taller than the featherweight. So same thing again, with a featherweight, obviously, I turn it that way. This is a wide part of your machine, but so's the wheel side. What I'm gonna do, if I hold it like that, although this is wider than the wheel end, the wheel is actually higher. So I'm gonna keep it at the wheel end anyway. Same thing again, I'm just gonna push the machine up to a base, to a wall. And I'm going to do the same thing again. Now you might want to factor in maybe having some thread on top of your spool pin or not. Let me just turn the camera so that you can see that a bit better. But I'm going to do the same thing again. I don't usually leave thread on the machine. But what I'm going to do is mark across the top. Now, my ruler is hitting the end of here, so that means I know it's gonna take in that piece, and then I'm gonna just butt it up there and knock it down. Let's do the other side. Now if you've got a featherweight or any machine, you might have a motor here, so you're gonna have to incorporate the motor. I'm going to go about there. Now you can see my ruler is pushing on this piece, so I know that the pattern piece I make for this end will also reflect on the other end. Button it up as close to the machine as I can, and I'm just making a mark. And then if you've got a motor, you would just lean your ruler against that motor. So now you can see that's the shape of the featherweight side piece. If I turn it over, that's the shape for the 128 machine. This dotted line here is if I wanted to make the cover just come to the top of the base. If I was going to cover the whole base, then I know that my line goes to the bottom of the cardboard. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to cut this out, but I'm going to pause the video and get this cut. So I've cut my pattern piece out. I've actually used the featherweight one. So I know now that this is my side piece for my machine cover. And I can check both on this side. Oh, I can't see that. I know that that will fit on that side of the machine. And then I know, if I turn it, that that will completely cover the other side of the machine. So that's now my pattern piece. I've then measured right away across, so going from the thickest part here, because obviously this domes, or this curves towards the machine, so that's my widest part. And then I've marked it against the hand crank end, which is the other widest part. It's actually got the hinge of the handle, but I've gone by the widest part. If you're not too sure what your widest part is, then just get a small piece of cardboard. Let me just move that down. Small piece of cardboard and just line that up to your end. As long as your cardboard is flat, you can line that up and that will hit the widest part. And then you can measure from that point all the way to the other point. Now, the most difficult part is, okay, so you know how wide it is. I know that my machine is 11.5 inches wide, which I've written down, but I also had to add the seam, and the seam is going to be 1 inch either side, because you don't want the machine to be, the cover to be too tight. So although the width is 11.5, I'm going to add 2 inches, so I know that it's 13.5 inches wide. Great. So I know my side pieces and I know the length. What I haven't worked out is what that piece of fabric is going to be. How long to cut that piece. Now, there is complicated maths that you could use, but there is a magical little tool that will help you work that out much easier. And hopefully you've all got a flexible fabric measuring tape. And the reason why we use cardboard as opposed to just paper is because cardboard's got a thickness on it. And you simply use the fabric tape to measure your shape all the way round. And it doesn't matter what shape that is, because the fabric tape will work its way round. Now, mine's telling me 30.5 inches. I'm going to write that down. You don't need a seam allowance on this because you factored in your seam allowance on your side panels and on your width. This is just the fabric that goes over the top. So now I have my 3 measurements. I've got my pattern piece that's on the sides. I know the width, the length of the piece of fabric in the middle, and I now know, because I've measured round, exactly how much I need. So I'm going to be cutting 2 of these. I'm also going to be cutting 1 piece, which for my featherweight is going to be 13.5 inches by 30.5 inches. I now have my pattern pieces. Now you can do this with any shaped machine. You can do this on the plastic machines. You can do this on machines with a case. For example, let me just grab my phone. A machine with a case, you could do the same thing. So you're going to butt this up to the cardboard and then make your mark. So you're going to get a nice curved edge. But by putting the ruler on the top, you know that the tallest part isn't actually the side pieces, it's the handle. So you can then incorporate the handle. And the same thing, actually it's easier knowing the exact width, but like mine's got hinges that stick out. The wood isn't completely perfect, so you can always do a double measurement, but this will work the same. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut my fabric pieces out, and then on my next video I'll talk to you about foam and the importance of using foam or a thick interface so that you don't have a cover that goes saggy.